Hi class, welcome back. I wanted to finish off animation with showing you MASH dynamics, and I think you'll really enjoy this. And actually there's just a lot you can try on your own and have fun with. I'll just show you some of the basics and let's get going. So first, it's best to just show something with objects in the scene. So I'll go to Poly Modeling, put in a simple cube. And then when you're working with MASH, a couple of ways you can go into its interface. You can be under the FX tab, and then you'll see the MASH drop-down window. You can also find it in the shelf here, which I tend to kind of gravitate toward that. So once you have a simple object, so we're going to start kind of basic here, I'm going to create a MASH network. So if you click on this cube here, if you go to MASH, you can do the same thing here. You can click on Create MASH Network. A couple of things happen. So by default, this cube, your object is taken and is distributed. And then you'll see a couple of new nodes that appear in the attribute editor. You have the MASH1 distribute. You have the initial tab, which is the waiter. And the waiter has all of the additional nodes that you can include. And then there's the MASH repro, which is essentially another way we can use the distribute and then kind of get into some other settings in here as well. So back into the MASH distribute. So kind of looking at this, let's check out what we have. By default, we have number of points 10. Distribution type. So right now this is in a line, so that's linear. Pretty kind of standard down here. You have the distance, so depending on the distance you want to go, if you want to go up or down, so you can put those options in accordingly. Some cool stuff you can do here, if you open that up, you have radial. So if you have that, you can up the points, so you can see that you can have more points. You have the radius, the angle, and so on. There's also an offset. So you can, this one's kind of cool. The radial, you can essentially create this little chain here. There we go. So anyway, that's radial. So you can play around with these. There's sphere. And then again, if you kind of fill it up, you can have more number of points in there as well. And then we'll get into some other ones in a bit. The one that I want to do is grid. And then here we have the distance. So how far apart do I want these to be? And then how many do I want in my grid, right? So let's say I do something like 888. And then here I'll probably need to increase this. All right, if you guys want to try a lesser number, that's fine too. And then I'm going to do wireframe on shaded. It's just a little easier to see these cubes and what the animation is going to play out like. So here's a cool thing about MASH. So if I go back to the waiter tab, I see that I have all of these nodes that I can add. This essentially adds different animations to your object. Now, one way I'd like to actually kind of have this in a separate window essentially is to bring up what's called the MASH editor. So from this MASH shelf, I can grab this icon here, kind of looks like our outliner in the way. And then you can also similarly go to the MASH dropdown, and then here's the MASH editor. All right, so I have my MASH editor here. I'm going to, and then this is nice too because it's a good way of getting into your node. So again, think of this as an outliner essentially for MASH. So here we are, you can always adjust your settings here. So to put this in a little more perspective, right now, this is just kind of sitting there. If I were to hit play, well, nothing happens because technically there's really nothing going on yet. We distributed the object that we have, but we haven't really done anything with it yet. So we're going to add a node. A couple of ways you can do that are from the MASH editor. Click on the plus sign. You can also find that in, and if you look in your outliner, You have, right now we actually have one node. Let's fix that since we are dealing with MASH. We're going to go to Show, Objects. Let's go to Geometry, and then we'll do MASH. I'd like to be able to see what's going on here. Also under Display, let's choose Shapes, and then turn off DAG Objects Only. So this is nice because now I have, this is just a cleaned up way, and you may have to go back to setting this outliner back to normal, to the way you had it if you work on anything else. But in this case, I also have access to these nodes from the outliner as well as the MASH editor. All right, and the fastest way to make this thing move is to add dynamics. So I'm going to drop down here in the menu and then click on Dynamics. Again, similarly, you can find that here. All right, so what happens with dynamics? Let me just show you. There's the dynamics node that appears. There is the bullet solver. So this is actually using what we just left off talking about, using bullet animation. So kind of similar concept here. If you click on that, the bullet solver shape, you have your ground, which you'll see is positioned actually down here, lower. So here you go. And then again, you don't have to have that. So, you know, you can change where this ground is located. All right, but I'm actually going to go into the dynamics window here and then scroll up to kind of show you what's going on. I'm just going to hit play and then let all those cubes fall. They will fall and then they will spread around the surface. Again, you do have some options you can play with, such as the mass of your, you know, the physical properties, the friction, the rolling friction. So these are all of these attributes that you can play with to see how this is going to affect how the cubes interact with one another. Then there's velocity. So these are all, again, just kind of things you can set there. So there it is. And before I move on to creating a new scene, just to keep playing with our MASH editor, there's still some things that I can do with this. So just to show you how you can keep adding more nodes. So for example, let's say we test color. So once we attach color, you'll see that color node, and then you can attach an actual color. You can click on the color to bring up your color chart. You can click on the map icon, and then again, so you do have, you know, the same type of a create render node window that'll appear that you're used to. Different shaders such as AI standard surface and so on. The different Maya surfaces. You can bring in an image. You also have random hues. So let me just pick a color here. Maybe just one of these. It's a little bright. Let me just, here we go. So then you have random hue. So I'm just going to do that for the sake of just seeing these cubes kind of a little better. So here we go. There's a little saturation. Anyway, so you can really play around with this. Lots you can do with color as well. And then again, this actually makes it a little easier to see what's really going on. All right, so let's say now that we're in here, let's say you realize that you don't want this color. You have these kind of on and off buttons here in the MASH editor. It's really as simple as just turning that off. If you don't want this at all, then you can just right click and click delete. Now, again, I feel like actually for this one, I'm going to turn this off. And then let's see what else we could do here. So another thing well, actually, before I get into putting little constraints, glue on this thing, I'm going to show you something under Dynamics. So under the Dynamics node, scrolling down, you'll see something called, well, actually, nope. That's not what I wanted to do. Let me see. Maybe I will actually show you the part that I wanted to show you, and then we'll move on to the next piece. All right, so under Dynamics, we're going to attach a constraint. So you're going to right click and click create in this empty window. So now you'll see a mesh constraint node. Cool thing is you'll also see it in the outliner, so it makes it easier to click on that and then be taken straight into the attribute editor of that. Now, watch this. Look at all these little lines, right? Those are all the little constraints that are created, keeping that together. The type is set to glue. You have spring, you have slider, and so on. So let me just hit play just to start demonstrating what's going on here. And you'll see that they kind of have this nice little bounce effect while staying essentially glued together, even with that relative space between each cube. Now, let's see here. You can choose for them to be breakable and then choose a threshold. This is something I'll have to kind of just play with the settings as we go. So as this falls, so they do break apart, however, some of the pieces stay. I'm going to up my frames here at the bottom just to have this animation play out longer. Break-in threshold, let's see, I'm going to up that number. Maybe not so high. All right, hit play. All right, so then you'll see that some pieces stick together, right? But ultimately they can have the ability to break apart. So that's pretty cool too. All right, and then I can turn my color back on if I need to. I thought with the bright color it was actually a little too distracting, so that's why I turned it off. So for the next little exercises we'll do, it'll be easier for me to just kind of start over with something fresh. But as you can see, you can keep adding and adding these nodes onto the same mesh network. So that really doesn't matter. You can keep going. This is telling me that there's something else attached within this dynamic node, which is the mesh constraint. So yet another way to get to that attribute editor portion from the mesh editor. So I do like to keep this open, but again, the way we organize the outliner makes it easier that way as well. Let's see what else we have in the, just let me open that up. No, actually I'll keep this as is. Maybe I'll just play with the distribute settings a little bit more on the next little exercise. And then under dynamics, let's see, you also have an initial state, something I want to point out. You can initially set this object to be sleeping. All right, and then I've gone over some of the physical properties. All right, so you can save this, but I'm going to open up a new scene just to have something fresh to work with. It doesn't have to always be a cube. So let's say I try, I'm going to go with a cone here. Okay, I'm just going to, I'm going to flip this thing. Maybe this way, and then translate Y. I think I'll take it down a notch. And then scale Y. Let me just make this a little bit longer. All right, so I'm going to use this for the next mesh network. So I actually have the mesh editor already open, and I can create the network directly from that. So I'm going to create mesh network. And again, by default, you have that distribute node that appears. And then we're going to customize it a little bit. So under mesh distribute, I can, maybe for this one, let's try radial. Let's increase the number of points. Kind of perfectly went to 20. I'll stick with that. You have your Z offset again, so you can do that. So I'm going to just try something different now. I'm going to test out different nodes. So with this little layout, I'll go to my little plus sign here, and then let me do a signal. So signal here, and I'm actually, oh, what? I'm in 2019, okay. An earlier version actually called it noise, so right now we're in signal. And if I were to hit play, this is kind of what's going on. And then we can come over here to the settings of noise, and you can kind of test out what's going on here. Curl noise. So again, just have some different variations for the signal type. And then you have transformation space, world or local. And then position I can leave. We have rotation, we can rotate. So again, you can definitely add some different noise in here and play with those settings. All right. Now, and I can probably add a color here, or I'll just stick with this. I'll just turn on wireframe unshaded. That's good enough. All right, so that is signal. Again, different ways you can actually play with that, and then we'll test it again in a moment. And then I'm going to go to plus, and then let me show you replicator. So if I add my replicator, I'm going to come up here. Offset position. Well, actually I need replicants first. So how many replicants do I want? Maybe I'll start with 5 just to see how that looks. Let me turn off that. There we go. Okay, maybe a little more, maybe 10. All right. So now I have replicated the radial distribution that I had. And again, you can kind of see, I'm just going to scrub these values so you can see just some of the different ways that you can go about this. This is kind of cool. All right. And then again, with this now, I can go back to distribute, for example, and let's say I have an offset here. So I can still kind of make it that little that DNA chain. I can go back to signal and customize further. So I can twist the position. I can change all that around, give it some variation. There's different rotation I can do. There's also scale that's going to add some variance to this. So again, once you put these nodes in, the fun part is to try them out together and then get something cool. You have your position ramp. This is another one. We're used to seeing this little picture here, this little graph. So here we go. So I can really just customize my position in the way that I'd like here. So that's all on the replicator. I have scale, so I can scale my replicants. You can scale them together, and then the scale ramp, and so on. This keeps going. You have the rotation, and then you can literally keep going, right? Some cool stuff you can do here. I'm going to bring in just a simple cube again, create my network. All right, and then I'm going to go to distribute here. I'll make a grid, and then maybe I'm not going to go so high. This is probably good enough. And then from there, let me add my signal just to give it a little bit of this motion variation here. Perfect. Think of that as the noise. And after that, I am going to up this a little bit now that I think about it. And then this will be maybe, okay. Just so I have a little bit more filled up in my scene here. All right, so then under the signal, I'm going to scroll down here, and then what I have is an area for a fall-off object. This will allow me to add a new node in the scene And let's watch what happens when I do. I'm going to click create. So it's a movable node. And again, remember that this little icon indicates that you do have something else within this specific node here. This node, you're able to move it. So if you grab your move tool, you can move it. And watch what happens. So the fall off means that this signal node that we've added does not actually affect the objects until the fall off node comes through your object. So this is kind of the cool thing here. So if I do this, there it is, right? Maybe it's over here. And again, I can also make this dynamic. I mean, this is already moving based on the noise, but you can still add dynamics in here as well. So again, the fall off node is going to be there. And then I'm just going to, maybe I'll just put it here. I'm going to have to play with the actual, the fall off node. And then add some additional settings. But, and then if I take off dynamics, so again, so pretty cool. So you can add a fall off node that again will not necessarily change your objects until they go through the node. And then a couple of quick things here. You have the shape of the node, so you can change that if you'd like. But I'm just going to leave it as is. And you know, how big of an inner zone you have, how much it's going to affect the objects that are being deformed essentially by this. All right, so I can turn off this. So actually I can, if you decide that you don't want this, you can just remove it, kind of turn it on or off. You can also just break the connection and then just delete it. Another thing you'll notice, and I'm actually, let's see here, show an outliner, so you can just gravitate toward that in your outliner directly from the attribute editor. So all these different ways to move around within the MASH editor and the MASH network, so to speak. All right, and then just to point out a couple of things here, what else we have. We do have, we went through color. There's so many to look through here. There really is a lot. We will go through some of them, and then some of the other ones I highly recommend that you guys just try it. You know, it's a lot of just kind of getting it into the editor and then playing around with the settings. And then let me see on this one. I keep going back to that, but I'm going to leave it. So in this case, let me just turn off, let's see, maybe signal, turn dynamics back on. Okay. All right, so on this one I didn't have the glue. And then I'm just going to keep going with what I have here rather than starting over. Another thing would be to, let me try, for example, transform. It seems like a simple one, but what this is going to do is it's actually going to have you move your object around. So let me take my transform here. And then I want to move all those cubes together. Let's say I want to rotate this whole cube, you know, solid. So under transform, I'm going to actually right click where it says controller null and click create. And now I'm just going to rotate this. All right. And then just have that block of little cubes fall slightly differently. All right, so as simple as this is, it just gives you a nice way of selecting everything together and just allowing you to move around a little easier. So that's the transform node. All right, so I want to move on and show you some other cool stuff here. So for example, this is a little messy. I'd like to just start fresh. Let me go to File, New Scene. Similar concept. I'm going to just put a little, maybe I'll just do a sphere. And then I'm going to create a mesh network out of that. And then I'm going to add my signal. All right. And then kind of customize this a little bit. Let's see what it's doing now. I don't really have a lot though, so let me distribute this a little bit better here. So we have spherical. Let me try that. I'm going to increase the number of spheres we have. All right, here we go. So they're kind of moving around. Let me see what else I can do with signal here. And then maybe I'll just change some of their position. So they're moving around a little bit more. Okay, I'm going to just try a couple of things here. I'm going to add a, let's see, how about flight? Let me make sure this is set to every frame. So here they go. They kind of explode out and start flying around. And then again, I did have noise, so let me see what happens if I remove that. There we go, just to keep it a little less erratic here. All right, so moving on with actually this little animation flight shape in mind here. And again, there are a lot of different attributes you can choose here, such as the speed, the maximum speed. Maybe we don't want it to be so fast. See how they slow down toward the end there. You know, I can bring a lot of these values down. There's always the mass. All of that's going to be affected. And let's see here, search distance, number of companions, so we can lower that as well. Separation strength. Yeah, kind of keeping them a little different, right? So from here, I can go to add another node, and then what I want to add is trails. So let me add trails here. Here it is. And then I'm going to do, let's say, about 50 in max trails, and then the scale maybe about a 2. Here they go. And not only are they flying around now, they also have some trails attached to them. So this is kind of cool too. And you'll see it again, and this is why it's good to have this outliner organized in the way where we just literally see our shapes or our mesh, and then anything that's related to MASH. So it just makes it really easy and organized to then be taken into the attribute editor to test out what we have here. All right, so that's your trails. And you don't really even have to have flight. But right now I have no animation. So in that case, if you want to have some sort of animation, this is where you can add the noise. So the signal, you can do dynamics. So if I add dynamics, not a whole lot happening here with my trails because there's not really that much happening in here for that to take place. So this is where it really works with flight shape. It also really works with signal. So you'll see that when you test it out. All right, so I'm going to turn this back on. All right, so that is adding trails. Okay, for this one, let's make some type and let's add Mash Dynamics to our type. Now, you can go directly from the Mash shelf and then click on the type here. You can go to Create and then click on Type. I'm going to just click on the type here. I'm going to make this in 2 lines here, making text. And then you can change the font and everything. I've gone over this a little bit before in one of my earlier tutorials, so you can go back to that or play around with the settings here. Now, this is going to be a little different. I don't want to just click on Create a Mash Network because I want to treat all of these letters independently and make them dynamic. So with my type selected, I can go to Mash, go to Dynamics, and then add Shell Dynamics. When I do that, let's see what we have here. We have our Dynamics node, which we have already seen. We also have our Dynamics initial state. This is applied to basically preserving the text as is and the way we see it here. So when I hit play now, the letters fall down how they should. All right, maybe I'll try 24 frames per second on this one. All right, here we go. So they'll fall and break apart. Now, and then I can keep going here. So for example, let's say, not really trails, but maybe I'll do, maybe just a signal, just to see. So here we go. That's adding a little bit of, here we go. Adds just some motion, some noise. And then from there, I can give it a little bit of a, kind of like an interesting little spin to it as well. Here we go. And then let me see if I can move signal down here. All right. So again, as you can see, even though this is text, it is treated as a mash, and then I can continue to add different nodes in here as well. All right, moving on. New scene. Let me just show you a quick and cool way to add mash to particles. So actually we're going to go to End Particles, make sure you're in the FX tab. Let's go to End Particles and then create an emitter. Let's see, this is going to flow down. Let's change that a little bit. I'm going to go Nucleus, and then let's see here, gravity direction. Let me just go here. All right, and then let's just add a little bit something to this. By the way, notice how we're not seeing this in the outliner, and I do need to see it. So under Objects, I'm going to just actually just go clear below, and then here, turn on DAG Objects Only, and turn off Shapes, just to clean this up a little bit. All right, now with my particle, I do want to add a little bit of a field to this, just to give it something. So I'm going to do turbulence, maybe add a little bit of a magnitude, frequency. Let's see how this plays out when the particles come out. They're a little more spread out, and then let me just, all right, cool. All right, let me see. Okay, cool. Just want to spread them out a little bit as they flow out of the emitter. All right, and then with my end particle selected, if I go under Mash, and then I have Utilities, this is very simple actually, so all we have to do is go to Add Trails to Particles. And then when I hit play, all my particles now have trails. Now the trails, you'll see they'll kind of go away, right? And that's just based off their settings. So that's going to be something that I'll want to change. This is kind of cool, right? And then you do have the trail node, so you can come in here and change the trail length, the max trails. So again, maybe this is something you want to change here. Instead of max trails, you'll increase the number so they can keep going. So let's say 300, right? So now as the particles keep flowing out, so will the trails. Their scale. And then the decay, this is something I'll have to kind of play with the settings a little. Let's see here. I'll turn that off. All right. So this is now connecting MASH to particles. So a lot of cool stuff you can do here. And again, I haven't even played with the particles themselves. You can still customize how those look and then how your trails look. So again, you guys, please feel free to, let me just do don't save here. Feel free to really just play around with the MASH network. There's so much more that I can show you in this. If you have any questions, I'll definitely answer them. But you know, at this point, I just wanted to introduce you to this, just so you know it's here. It's a really cool, you know, it's a really cool feature to try out. Hopefully next semester we can get into a little bit more on this, once we get back into a routine. And but yeah, so play around with this, try all the different nodes, see what they do, see how they interact with one another, and you know, how one works over the other, how they all work together, and then you know, I think you'll have fun here. All right, so you can save your files if you'd like. You don't have to turn this in, and then we will be moving on to creating characters.